Hey everybody, it's Matt Nelson of the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm here this time with Assistant Professor of Theology at the University of Dallas, Dr. Irene Alexander. She's an expert on marriage and the Gospels, and we're going to be talking about that today. So, Dr. Alexander, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you're at the University of Dallas, just down the road from here. And I'd be interested to know, before we get into the main theme for this conversation, how did you get into this vocation as a theologian? What's kind of the story behind that?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a Catholic family, and actually I went to Catholic school my whole life. But when I was in high school, towards the end of high school, I really wanted to be a doctor, like a pediatrician, a medical doctor. And I was one of those people that I'm so sure I want to be a doctor. I actually started enrolling in like some classes for kids in high school who knew they wanted to be pre-med, and my dad graciously drove me all over the place. But when I first arrived at college, I started taking some classes in philosophy and theology. I had taken some theology in high school, but philosophy was kind of new for me in college. And it really opened up a new world for me because I really loved anatomy and physiology. And what I loved about it was just how organized everything is in the human body is just so fascinating and miraculous. And for me, the question that had fascinated me at the time was, what is the body made of? How does this work? But in philosophy, they ask a different question, which is, what is man made for? And that really stood out to me. I had never really asked that in a kind of substantial way. And so I really started kind of loving those classes, philosophy and theology, a little bit more, even than my biology classes. And then I also started noticing something going on in Catholic universities, a little bit in the one I had attended and also in others, which is that a lot of times Catholic students go to university and they end up losing their faith. And a lot of times this happens because of kind of an intellectual attack. So, for example, I remember when I was in college and this one friend of mine in philosophy, I had just changed to a philosophy major. I was a double major, philosophy and theology. And he was like, "Oh, why'd you change?" And I said, "Well, I really want to understand the truth of things." And he said, "Oh, you're in the wrong major for that." And I said, "What?" This is where we ask those questions about who is man and where does he come from and what's the ultimate purpose of his life. And I started to realize that there's a heavy dose of skepticism that in a way can even deliberately try to pit faith against reason. And the net result is students come, they think they're learning things, they think they become enlightened, they lose their faith, and it has terrible, massive destructive consequences in their lives, which I saw among my own classmates. And that really, like that experience started this new passion within me. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, like I have to learn more. Like I know that somehow faith and reason don't contradict. This is like so clear in the early church fathers and, all the great minds of the tradition. We even see the early philosophers, or early church fathers actually read the early philosophers and they saw a lot of, harmony and wisdom there. And so it was really a passion of mine to figure out what are the answers to these things, these questions, faith and science and all of these kind of new movements. So I told my parents, yeah, even though you took me all these classes, I'm changing my major. That was kind of a shocker. To philosophy and theology. People say, what are you going to do with that? It's not like nursing, So I just wanted to say I was a nursing major, because everybody knows you're going to do. But anyway, I went on to graduate school at Ave Maria University, and I just absolutely loved it. I just went so deep into the riches of the faith. And this is what really inspires me is seeing, a bright group of students like we have at University of Dallas, and they come with their tough questions and we wrestle through them in the classroom. And I love to be able to show them that there are these riches of the faith that maybe nobody's hearing. So that's really kind of how I feel like it's sort of a call, I guess, call to be a theologian really came about.
Well, it's such a relatable story for me personally, and I'm going to avoid talking about myself too much here, but as a former practicing chiropractor, I mean, my chiropractic school, you basically live and breathe in the anatomy lab for 2.5 years, studying the human body, the human nervous system, and it's just about all that. It feels like it's all you do from the time you wake up till the time you go to sleep. But it's been interesting to see the sort of transference of thinking and even to an extent skill from physiological occupation to now being sort of in knowledge work, thinking and speaking and teaching. It is fascinating how the human body is so logically made, and how that inner logic, both from an anatomical perspective, but then from a deeper philosophical perspective of the human person, how that just drives us to life's biggest questions. So it's such a fascinating story of how you've gotten to where you are today. Well, let's dive right into our topic for today, and that is marriage and the Gospels. Let's start with probably the most obvious. Like, when we think about the New Testament and marriage, a lot of people right away think of the wedding at Cana in John's Gospel. I'm going to let you take over. Talk about the wedding at Cana. What does it teach us about marriage, first of all? But then also, like, does it teach us anything practically about how to be married once we're there?
Yeah. Yes. This is such a great topic, and I love that particular passage in John's Gospel. Full disclosure, John's Gospel is actually personally my favorite Gospel, although I do love all the Gospels. It's speaking of wine and the wedding of Cana. It is John's Gospel is kind of like a rich aged wine. It was the last of the Gospels to be written, and in a way, John sort of sits with the insights of what this Gospel means, and it has sort of aged, and you see a lot of the symbolism coming through his work. So let's start there. At the wedding feast of Cana, you have Mary, the mother of God. Notice that this couple who is having the wedding has run out of wine. And first of all, that's very fascinating because you really see a little bit of the feminine genius there. It's women who typically notice the needs first before, the human person. And by the way, that could be a source of marriage stress, because sometimes women feel like, why am I the only one who notices this? How come he doesn't see that? And then they complain, but notice what she does. She's very wise. Here's what the wisest woman in the world does when she wants more wine. Okay. She notices, first of all, that there's this lack, and she tells her son, they have no wine. Now, I want to come back to this line because it's actually very bizarre, his reply to her. Maybe I'll start with this first, and then I'll do the practical side. But when he says, woman, what concern is this? My hour has not yet come. It's very bizarre because in John's Gospel, the hour refers to his death. So in later parts, he'll say, now, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And he's talking about the crucifixion. So just think about for a moment how weird this is. She says they're out of wine, and he says, it's not time for me to die. Okay, that's bizarre. So what's going on there? So in the early prophets, the later prophets, we have Amos and Isaiah, they are talking about the day of the Lord's coming as being accompanied by this feast of wine, and the lack of salvation, the lack of joy being like a dearth of wine. So you have quotes from the prophets. There's the vine languishes, the merry-hearted sigh. There's an outcry in the streets for a lack of wine, it says in the prophets. So notice what's happening. Mary says they're out of wine, and Christ says to her, my hour has not yet come, meaning he takes her point about the dearth of the wine as a sign that now he's going to bring about the fulfillment of what Israel is longing for, right? The joy of salvation, the knowing of the true God. But he tells her this is not really the time for that, right? It's not yet the time for the crucifixion. Nevertheless, he's going to do a sign that's going to tell us something about the meaning of the cross. Okay, so Mary tells the servants, okay, do whatever he tells you. And I'm going to come back to that because you really see femininity here, in a wonderful way. But so Christ, gathers the servants and they fill 6 of these ceremonial jugs with water. Now, remember this number 6. 6 is always important because 7, as you know, is a very important biblical number. There's 7 days of creation. It represents a kind of wholeness and completeness. Let's see, also in John's gospel, at the Samaritan woman at the well, she's been with 5 men, and the one she's with now is not her husband. That's 6, okay? And Christ meets her at the well, where the patriarchs often met their spouses. It's like the bridegroom.
Oh, okay.
There's the 7, okay? So there's a lot going on here in John with the numbers. And so he then transforms the water into wine, okay? And John tells us this is the first of the signs of John's gospel, which, by the way, there's also 7 signs in John's gospel, and this one is the first of those 7. Now, all of those signs, they're a real event that's happening, a real miracle, but they're also pointing to something deeper about the mystery of the cross. So a couple things to note here about the wine, the water changing to the wine. The first of the plagues, if you remember, back in Egypt when they are Israel's under captivity, was the changing of the Nile water into blood. Okay, and here's the first of the signs. Now, here's also the connection back with Exodus, is that the whole passage starts out by saying on the 3rd day there was this wedding feast at Cana. Now, what's interesting about that, a couple things, is that if you're following the prologue, each section of John up until that point says the next day, the next day, the next day, and then the 3rd day. But it's too many days for it to be the 3rd day if you're counting. So there's something strange happening. In fact, it could also add up to 7 days there. But for Israel, when they were going to have this covenant with God at Mount Sinai, God told them, prepare yourself for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day, I will come. And he creates this covenantal bond with Israel. So notice what's happening here. Jesus is the covenanting bridegroom God of Israel, who is now performing a sign that the God of the universe, now incarnate in himself, is going to come and bring about this salvation. And not only that, he's actually acting like a Jewish bridegroom in this passage. So one of the things that happens in this narrative is the head waiter takes a sip of the wine and he says, most people keep serve the good wine first and then inferior wine. Okay, we all know why that is. Okay, right? You get a little tipsy and nobody cares about the quality of the wine. Okay, you serve the best stuff first. Okay, but you have kept the good wine until now. And that's fascinating because, first of all, you have the old covenant, and now is the new, right? The good wine is now. The other reason why that's fascinating is because notice who he's giving the wine to. He's going to the guy who's getting married, the bridegroom. Because in a Jewish tradition, it's the bridegroom's job to provide the wine for the wedding. Okay, just as a historical fact. So what is Jesus doing? He's the one providing the wine for the wedding. So he's revealing who he is as the covenanting bridegroom of Israel, who is now doing this first of the signs precisely at a wedding. Now, this is very important for a number of reasons. One is that the love between a man and a woman is the sign that God chose to be the great analogy between himself and his people. And this is the key connection between the wedding at Cana and the cross. So remember, the 6 ceremonial jars filled with water turned to wine. 6 tells you there's an incompleteness. It's almost 7, but not quite. Because in John's gospel, only in John, at the cross, John 19, John 20, John, first of all, there's another key parallel here, which is between the woman. Okay, and I want to say more about the woman here, but the woman is in the wedding at Cana and the woman also on the cross. So there's that key parallel, and Christ calls her that. He calls her woman, How does this concern affect me? Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And so on the cross, only in John's gospel do we get this scene where a soldier comes and pierces him with the lance, and the blood and the water flow from the side of Christ, right? That's where the new wine is ultimately poured out, right? That's the 7th. That's where the fullness is finally being given forth on the cross. And even more than this, here's a connection back to Genesis. And this is something you find in the early church fathers. John Chrysostom comments on this. And he says that, look, Adam and Eve in the beginning, how are they made, right? You have in the second creation account, Eve being made from the side of Adam. And he says, look, he makes Eve not from the head bone or something, like she should lord over him, not from his feet, that she should be his slave, but right directly from his own heart, right? That she's his equal and yet in some ways also different. And notice what's happening on the cross. When the side of Christ is pierced and that blood and water flowing freely from his side, it's from his side that a new wife comes forth, right? And this wife is the church. And so in the blood and the water, you see the two signs of baptism and Eucharist, so the giving of the sacraments. And this is what Paul says when he says, look, that they're in Ephesians 5, that this love between bridegroom and bride is a sign of this deeper love between Christ and the church, right? And it's on the cross that Christ really acts as the true bridegroom, because he's laying down his life for the bride, right? It's the ultimate heroic activity. And notice that the bride's job is to just receive that love.
Yeah. I was going to say, you're clearly influenced, and I don't know how you couldn't be as a moral theologian and a Catholic, clearly influenced by St. John Paul II. And I'm sure he had a lot to say about these passages as well. It's just absolutely striking how when you read in John's Gospel, the wedding at Cana, you read the narrative, at face value, it doesn't seem like a whole lot's going on. It kind of just seems like, oh, they've got, they ran out of wine at the wedding. That's a problem. If you've ever been to a wedding, if you're going to run out of, if the bar is going to run dry, that's a problem. So then, Mary says, Jesus, do something about this. And then it appears like Jesus says, nah, I don't think this is the right time for that. And then you get kind of Mary just kind of smirking and looking away saying, do whatever he tells you. Like she knows he's going to listen to her anyways. And then the wine, there's a miracle. The wine is now there. It's good wine and that's it. And then off we go. But there's so much more to it. It's absolutely staggering to hear you break this down for us. Is there anything practical in this passage that we could take away?
Yeah. So what I want to do in order to flesh out what I think are some really great practical implications for marriage on this, I want to draw the parallel that John does between the woman. Who's he talking about? Okay, woman. It's odd, right? That you would, don't try this at home, kids. Don't say, to your mom, don't say, woman, where's my supper?
That's right.
So what's he doing? Is he being disrespectful? Okay, that's kind of odd to call her that. It's not odd if you're John, the evangelist, because what you're doing there is you're drawing a key parallel between Mary and Eve. That's what you're doing, okay? Because in Genesis 3:14, this is the proto-evangelion, where right after the fall of man, God announces that the woman will crush, offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. Okay, so he wants you, in other words, think about what's happening here. In the beginning, you had a fall, and now is the time for redemption. But what I want to do here is draw a careful parallel about marriage. So I want to talk just to draw out the practical insights just for a few minutes about the fall of Adam and Eve. And what's curious about this, we discuss this all the time in our Understanding the Bible class, and just meditating on this over and over have given me a lot of, time to think about how could this have happened? Have you ever wondered, how did the fall really happen? How could it be you're in this gorgeous place and everything's right, all your desires are ordered, everything's lovely, and then how they disobeyed God? How did this happen? Okay, well, if you look carefully at how this happened, you read between the lines, there's really a lot going on that's, I think, very practical for marriage. Because what most people don't realize is that original sin, the attack of the devil on Eve first and then Adam, was primarily attack against the unity of their marriage. Okay, now here's what I want to show you, is that Eve knows that they're not supposed to eat from this tree. Okay, well, how does she know that? In the second creation account, she's not even around yet when God gives this command to Adam. So presumably he's the one who told her, right? And that's an important detail, I think. Because here's how the fall happens. The devil, the serpent, goes to her and says, "Did God really say you can't eat from any tree of the garden?" Now look what he's doing. He's saying, like, look, this God, he puts you in this lush place, and he's kind of depriving you. Can't eat from anything. Now, if he's subtle, because that wasn't the real command. The real command was you can take everything you want. This is an abundant place and it's all for you. Just don't disobey me on this one thing. Okay, so Eve actually initially corrects him. She says, no, we can eat from everything, but we just can't eat from this one. But notice that the damage that was done to her heart, because the devil says to her, look at this God, how can you trust him? He's really holding out on you, and why was this lie so persuasive? It's persuasive because there is a little bit of an element of truth here, which is that the beatific vision was not yet given to them. Okay, so they're in Eden, they're in this paradise, but God had not really given them the fullness of himself. So in a way, he's right, okay? And Eve realizes this, and she, first of all, begins to desire more. She begins to desire more. And so when the serpent tells her, oh, you won't die, not only is he telling her, look, don't trust this God. He's holding out on you. Remember, who did she learn the command from? She learned it from Adam. He's telling her, oh, you won't die. He's saying, you can't trust Adam. You can't trust him. Okay? So notice that the fall began with an attack on the unity of marriage. And so what does Eve do, right? So she's the one who goes to the tree. Adam is with her. And they both do freely choose to eat the fruit, right? And so what's happening here? She takes the fruit, she gives it to him, like as if to say, I sort of dismiss what you have said and told me. I know better here, and you do what I say, okay? And here you go. And he also becomes interested in this too. And notice his position is that he's also now, Eve is going for this, and now he's also caught because he feels like I'm torn between this love I have for God and the love I have for Eve. Like, how could I live without Eve, right? I'm so drawn to her. In fact, the first human words of the Bible are a man's fascination with the beauty of a woman, right? This one at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Okay, so actually the fall was like this, okay? Eve began to desire more. In fact, St. Bonaventure calls her the first philosopher. She's desiring this more, and she doubts very much that God will give her the desire of her heart. She doubts very much that Adam will give her the desire of her heart. She thinks he's going to fail me. He's going to fail me. I have to do everything myself. And this is what causes the downward spiral and ultimately the first sin of parents. So go back to John's gospel now, okay? And the wedding feast at Cana, right? He's restoring the order of things, right? He's the new bridegroom, right? But he's also restoring marriage. And so it's very important to see that that the restoration of redemption also is going to include the restoration of marriage. Okay, so look at the Eve-Mary parallel here. I think it's very important because Eve doubted that God would come through for her. She doubted that the man in her life would come through for her. In fact, she didn't even say what she wanted. She didn't even express what her desire really was, right? So she feels caught, like between her desire for more, right, and her real fear, Adam will never give me what I really desire. Okay, now think about this with marriage. Okay, this is the situation of many women's hearts when you've lived a few years in marriage and you start to worry, is this man really going to come through for me? And she's caught between the strength of her desire for more in her marriage and her very real fear. Is he going to be the hero who comes through for me? Now look at what Mary does in the wedding feast at Cana. When she has a desire of her heart, she doesn't complain. She doesn't say, ugh, why am I the only one who notices that this wine is running out? Nobody ever does anything. I have to be the one, right? She doesn't do that. She doesn't point out to her son, the true bridegroom, how come you're not doing something? Okay. She doesn't first attack or comment on what he's doing or not doing, whatever. All she does is she just shares the desire of her heart, right? I want some more wine. Okay. Which, by the way, I love because I'm like, I also want some more wine.
Yeah.
My husband knows I love wine. He's always
Like a
buying.
good Catholic.
Yeah, like a good Catholic, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's a reason why God chose wine to be one of the sacramental symbols, right? That he turns into his own presence, right? He chose some of the best things in creation.
That's it.
Okay. And so what does she do, okay, when she's caught, when she's in the same situation as Eve, right, in a sense, right? She has this desire. But what she does is she shares her desire. She doesn't do it by saying, here's what you're doing wrong. Here's what you're failing to do. Or I don't trust you. You'd never come through for me, whatever. She just says, I'd like some more wine, right? And what does she also do? She shows that she trusts in the bridegroom, which in this case is her son. So it's like this. She's saying, here's what's on my heart, and I trust you. I trust that that my desire will influence your heart, right? And it does. And notice what else she does is she doesn't try to control the way or the means. Okay. She doesn't try to say, okay, well, here's what I think is what you should do. Okay. You need to do, X, Y, Z, run out here. Let's go buy some wine. She doesn't try to control how her desire will be met. All she does is express what she wants, and she trusts it to him, which is great because now what happens? The man is thinking, I'm going to, I want to please her, right? And I want to use the best of my own mind and perspective to come through for her, right? And that's exactly what happens, right? So I love to see this that on a very practical level. Okay, what is it that you want? Okay, I talk to a lot of women, who sometimes share their marriage problems with me, and I try to coach them in a way to get them some, here's what you can do differently, right? You don't have to point out what you think he's doing wrong. You don't have to point out, why you think he's failing you. You don't have to complain. All you need to do is share your desire and entrust it to him. He'll that's information. Now he has clear information on what you like and what you want. But you're also kind of giving up the control so that you allow his own initiative to be that which comes through for you. And by the way, that's how you fell in love in the first place, right? When man and woman are dating, right, what happens? You start sharing, more of yourself. You're growing this friendship. You say things like, oh yeah, I love these kinds of chocolates, and the man's like, okay, file that away. Okay, right. And then at some point, he surprises her, right? And that's how both she feels cherished and the man feels admired. Like, yeah, I did it. I came through for her, right? Because really at root, the way that we are designed as male and female is that we as women want to feel cherished, right? We want to be loved. In fact, in Love and Responsibility, John Paul has this great line where he says, a man wants to give love so that he will be loved. And a woman wants to be loved so that she can show love. Okay, there's a complementarity. So I interpret it like this, like a man really yearns to be admired, right, by the woman that he adores. And a woman really yearns to be adored by the man that she admires, right? So marriage is fulfilling when we're satisfying the distinctive desire of each other's hearts, right? And that happens through a kind of a pattern, right? It happens through, usually women are the ones who think things need, more, right? And that's also part of our nature, as women. And, but to be able to ask for what we want, right? And to trust, I married a great guy who's capable of coming through for me. That's really how marriages flourish. When a woman really feels adored and cherished, and when a man feels that he's admired and respected by his wife. I'll just say one final point on this, which is that the only pastoral advice that St. Paul gives specifically about marriage is in that same passage with Ephesians 5, where the love between bridegroom and bride is the symbol between Christ and the church. And then he tells, wives to be subject to their husbands, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And at the very end of that little section, he says, therefore, husbands should see to it that they love their wives, and wives should see to it that they respect their husband, which is fascinating because Paul is not like a politically correct kind of guy. He doesn't care like most people, that. In other words, what I want to say is in our day and age, there's this kind of thing, oh, men and women aren't really different. In fact, I started doing a research project on this a little while ago. There's a lot of, experts in marriage in the field of psychology that basically dismiss that men and women are different to begin with. Okay, Paul doesn't act that way. He knows, right, that there's a natural complementarity that, husbands really yearn to be admired and respected by their wives. Wives deeply yearn to be cherished. In a certain sense, there's kind of an onus on the woman in this sense that, you can't be cherished if you don't never say what you want, right? And that's why I love how Mary was like, here's what I want, right? She wasn't like just sulking around waiting for somebody else to do something. She noticed that, she wasn't getting the support she needed. No, she spoke up. She said, I'd like to have more wine, and the bridegroom came through, So I think you start to see this dynamic of here's what's on my heart, and I trust you. So we see this injunction: husbands, be willing to lay down your life for your wife, and not just in a literal way, but in a daily way. Okay, so make these sacrifices for her behalf, right? And then on the other hand, we get this be subject, sometimes translated submissive. I think that be subject is a little better to the modern ear in this sense, because sometimes when you hear the word be submissive, it sounds to the feminine ear, your desires don't matter at all. Whatever your husband says is the law of the land. That sometimes people hear that and they go, what do you mean? I have to be submissive. Oh my gosh, I'll never be happy. You're telling me I can't be happy? That's not what he's saying. He's actually saying something really practically helpful, I think, which is this: be subject means put yourself under his perspective. Okay, this is very helpful, I think, for in marriage in a practical way when you're negotiating things. Like sometimes, you say, well, I want to have a home birth, okay? And, the husband says, okay, I see that you don't want to have these interventions or whatever, but I also want to know that you're going to be taken care of, and what if there's a problem? And, and then sometimes a wife can just dismiss his perspective, right? So what's Paul saying? He's saying, no, place yourself under his perspective, value his perspective, right? See if there's something there that might even influence your desire, right? So, and this is a great way to solve problems, right? The woman knowing what she wants, what's important to her heart, but also turning to her husband and saying, well, what's your perspective, right? Because I trust you. I know you're an amazing man, and what you say matters. And I know that you'll come through for me. Okay. And I think that that's a beautiful way of, in a practical way, seeing that complementarity that was there in the beginning and living that out in your marriage. I think where a lot of times fighting happens is like this. It happens when, usually a woman will have a complaint like, oh, you're not doing X, whatever it is. I say, don't complain, just say what you want without complaining. But then, he'll respond, oh, well, I think this, and then she feels like, oh, he doesn't care about me. So instead of saying, oh, I understand and I value your perspective, I place myself under your perspective and I allow it to influence my desires. You just dismiss it, okay, which is in a way disrespectful. Now he feels like she doesn't care about what I think, But all of this drama can just be cleared up if we do something very simple that I think is rooted in Paul's pastoral advice, which is to know what you want, to say it in a positive way, and also to be respectful of, your husband's perspective, right? So be subject. So I don't think that Paul is saying, when he says wives, be subject or be submissive to your husband, I don't think he's saying whatever you want doesn't matter and whatever he says is the law of the land. I think what he's saying is, here's the natural complementarity between a man and a woman. Here's how your desire to be cherished is fulfilled. And here's how his desire for respect and admiration is also fulfilled, which I say is beautiful.
Such a skilled reading of that first part of John's gospel. And we could keep on going on that passage. I know it. I'm glad you brought up the 5th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, because in that 5th chapter, he basically gives us a nice little theological treatment of marriage. And that's the line that often, especially in today's day and age, it sticks out to us, as this idea of wives being subject to their husbands. And then the next thing that Paul says, like you've already pointed out, is that men or husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. All it takes is a reading of the whole gospel to find out what that means. Remember, Jesus washed the feet of his apostles. He ultimately gave up his life for the church on the cross. So that's it sounds like, oh, men are getting the better deal here, but really I think, there's almost a bigger burden being put on the shoulders of the husband in St. Paul's passage. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's saying, he's saying, look, be ready to die for her, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's saying. And, and most men, I think, they would, I'd take a bullet for my wife any day, but it's like, can you get up in the middle of the night,
Right, exactly.
The daily stuff is hard. Oh, she wishes that the dishes were done, that's hard, you're tired.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, in that sense, yeah, I do think that the burden or the onus maybe is on the husband, in the sense of, be willing to lay down your life for her. And wives, be willing to receive that love,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's great, in a way, women sort of get the better end of the deal in this sense, like, lay down your life for her, you receive him, acknowledge what he does, thank him. In fact, just something real simple, like even thanking him for what he does, tends to inspire men to want to give even more, because you feel like, wow, I can make her happy, I can please her. Somebody who's not pleasable, you sometimes feel like you just stop trying, because what can you do, but yeah, it's, and here's the other thing. When a man acts like that, when he acts like Christ, I'm willing to lay my life down for you, what woman wouldn't want that, right? That's what we all want. And I think that, what Paul is getting at here is how our hearts, in a natural way, as man and woman, are fulfilled. Because, if we never understand the natural analogy, how can we make sense of it on a divine level, Because the natural analogy is, think about how you fall in love. It's like this, right? A man becomes attracted to a woman becomes attracted to a man. But let me ask you, who asks who out? Usually when a guy, they start liking.
Usually the man.
Right. The man asks her out, right? There's a dynamic of pursuer and the pursued, right? Why? Because the shape of our hearts are different, right? A woman wants to be pursued, right? She wants to be adored. And a man, he wants to know that he can win this woman in his life, right? That she thinks he's the hero that can come through for her, right? And that's beautiful. And that is the analogy that God uses to describe salvation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating. I mean, it begins already in the Old Testament. The later prophets, they look back on the Sinai covenant like it was a wedding. They look back on it like Israel, here God speaking, thus saith through the prophet, you were like a virgin bride. I wooed you in the wilderness. I tried to win your heart. We had this covenant marriage, on Sinai, right? You gave yourself to me. I gave myself to you. There was a sacrificial banquet, right? And they beheld God and they ate and drank, it says in Exodus. And then in the New Testament, this is the very analogy that God uses to describe in the most profound way the love that he has for the church. Right now, he's taken a new bride from his own side, just like Eve from the side of Adam. And I love that image, by the way, of the rib surrounding the heart, because in a way it's really true. Like, a woman really does surround the heart of her man. He thinks about her, he's preoccupied with her. And this is the analogy that God has for us. He's thinking about us. He's pursuing us. He's the pursuer, and what do we need to do is to receive the love that he has for us. And that's why we kind of talk about the church as the bride of Christ, right? Because there's a natural analogate that's true in the created order. Even outside Catholicism, it's true of every man and woman. There's a shape in our hearts. And that's the natural analogate he uses to describe the love that he has for us. And in fact, the very end of the Bible, it ends like this, where the bride is expressing her desire for the bridegroom, right? Come, Lord Jesus, come. We say this at every Advent. Okay, what are we waiting for? We're the bride, and we're calling for the love of the bridegroom. When is he going to come, right? I want to be wooed. We want to be wooed, right? And there he is, he's going to come. And so even the prayer of the church has this aspect of the complementarity because it's the natural analogate. He's yearning, the bride yearning for the coming of the bridegroom, and Revelation describes heaven. Of course, it's an analogy, okay, but it describes it like a wedding banquet, right? Are we getting ourselves ready? Okay, and what do brides do? They spend a long time getting ready, right? And so, yeah, there's this wedding banquet, and that's the true wedding, right? That's why. You could go to the Sermon on the Mount here in a minute, but that's why in heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage, because there's the true wedding, which is the nuptial union, in an analogous way, between God and his people, the bride. So the whole thing, the whole mystery of salvation has to do with this deep love of marriage. In fact, even in the Old Testament, you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the patriarchs. God reveals himself in a covenant through marriage, through the family. And he chose to be the bridegroom as the primary way of revealing ultimately who the Father is.
So good. And I'm really glad that you brought up John Paul II's Love and Responsibility, written before he was Pope, of course. It's been a few years since I'll say I attempted to read it, because it is a very deep. Yeah, I mean, he was a world-class philosopher, and so there's a lot there on every page. But a common theme that keeps coming up in everything you're saying is complementarity between man and woman. And that's one thing that really stuck out in that book that I still remember today, is everything he has to say in that book about the complementarity of men and women. So he kind of shows us the nuances that show both the equality, but also the differences, the complementarity that are there between man and woman. So definitely a resource, I think, to encourage people to try to tackle. I think there's a lot there. And let's use that as a springboard then into one more question. I wanted to now turn to another marriage in the Gospels. This time we don't get a narrative of the wedding feast, but we get limited details on this marriage. But let's talk a little bit about the marriage between Mary and Joseph. What does their marriage have to teach us?
Yeah, so their marriage is obviously very unique, because Mary is the Virgin Mother of God. Okay, that is unique in many ways. One is that she's the recipient of the incarnation. Another way that it's unique, sometimes we call this a Josephite marriage, is that she remained a virgin. So you don't have the same consummation that is proper to natural marriage. However, I think you see a lot of the same kinds of things in their marriage. And first of all, we don't know a whole lot. Like the Gospels give us this sort of little snippets of their marriage. I'll share a few things. One is that I think that you see that the quiet life of Nazareth was a preparation for the redemption of the world. So it just shows you, one, the importance of the family, and just the quiet day-to-day activities. Sometimes, when you're living a married life, you feel like, oh, it's just sort of the same kind of thing, we just wake up and feed the kids and go to work. But what goes on in the family sets up how the world will be. Okay, it's how children experience the love and affection from their parents. It's how they know that they're lovable and that they have something worthy of contributing to the world. It's the school of the virtues, as John Paul says. So just the quiet life of Nazareth, the dignity of that work is a preparation for vocation. It's a preparation for our mission in life. I'd also say this: we have a couple little episodes where we see some interesting aspects about their marriage. One of which is when there's an angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, "You better get Mary and the baby out of here because Herod the Great is going to have this massacre of the infants." And there you also see Joseph as the protector, right, of the family. In a way, he's the head in that it's entrusted to him in a unique way to be the protector of the family, right? Now, and notice that Mary, she is subject to Joseph, right? And what he says, right? She doesn't argue, well, I never got that divine message. Sometimes I get divine messages too. How come I didn't get one? She trusts him, right? Mm-hmm. And she knows that that God is with him. I'm sure she prayed for him and with him. And he cared for her and protected her and loved her. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, but Joseph died, probably after the episode of the finding of Jesus in the temple. But by the time you get to the cross, Joseph isn't around, anymore. So Mary also experienced being a widow. So I think you see the nobility of the family. You see the beauty of man and woman. You see Mary treasuring the vocation that she had, which was a very unique vocation, wife, mother, and virgin. And in a way, she can be a model for all women, for all their vocations, because in a way, she embodies all of them in a unique way. And we also see Joseph, the formation of the father and son, Jesus being a carpenter like his dad, doing what dad does, mm-hmm. Dad mm-hmm. spending time with him, handing on also, the most important things that a son needs to know, which is that you are capable, you have what it takes, to be a man of God. And that's the most important thing I want to hand on to you, which is what Joseph did. Onto me. It's interesting to think about the human formation of Jesus under the guidance of Joseph. But because he had a fully human nature, and even though he was sinless, there's also that aspect of human formation, which took place under the guidance of Joseph in a unique way.
Would you also say that the marriage of Mary and Joseph also demonstrates for us that marital intimacy comes in many forms, that it's not that they didn't experience that sort of unique relationship that a husband and wife would experience with one another. It's just that there was an aspect of their life, the physical intimacy that typically we see between a husband and a wife in an ordinary couple. We didn't, that wasn't part of their life, but can you say something to that and then kind of leapfrog from what you have to say about that to then speaking about what this and other parts of the gospel teach us about the vocation to the religious life, where you take a vow of celibacy?
Yeah, sure. So the first part, what does it tell us? Really, the word you're hovering around here is intimacy. Right. And I love this word. In a way, it's kind of like saying, into me, see, intimacy. When you have intimacy with somebody, you've been vulnerable with this person and you share something of their life. They know about what's on your heart. You know what's on their heart. And even though, and maybe especially in a certain sense, because Mary and Joseph, they didn't have a sexual intimacy, doesn't mean that they didn't have intimacy. Right. And in fact, the latter, sexual intimacy is what follows from the real heart-to-heart intimacy, right? I think even John Paul says in Love and Responsibility at one point that the unification between man and woman has to be by way of love. And then there's relations that, in a sense, signify in the flesh what that love means. So even though they didn't signify that in the flesh, it doesn't mean that they didn't have that intimacy. So, I could see, Joseph, the way that he every day was doing hard manual labor for Mary, to support their livelihood, right? And her kind of receiving that love, being grateful for it, showing that, maybe even there were some hard times, hard in a different way. Like when you have a perfect child, it's just a different experience than when you give birth to regular children, who sometimes have tantrums and whatever, But I think that you see that probably, I'm sure Mary, was appreciative and of Joseph and all that he did for her, and as a result of that, you have intimacy, like when a woman receives the love that her husband is showing her, and she acknowledges it, it opens the way for tenderness. And I wanted to say a few words on that because John Paul II has a great little section in Love and Responsibility on tenderness in marriage. And he has some interesting things to say, one of which is he thinks that women have a greater need for tenderness just by our makeup. Women tend to be more emotional. By the way, he doesn't think that's a weakness. He thinks that's a richness. It's a gift that she gives to the world. He speaks a lot about the feminine genius. God entrusts the human person to us in a unique way. We feel so deeply for other people. We have natural gifts for empathy. Doesn't mean men can't be empathetic. They are, but in a unique way, this is more. So he thinks that women have a very deep need for intimacy and tenderness in marriage, and in a way that really can only happen through vulnerability, which I think that was kind of also part of the ground of their relationship. I mean, think about how it started. Mary is betrothed to Joseph, and then she is pregnant, and this is an odd situation, but they trust each other, right? And Joseph listens to the Lord, who says, don't be afraid by this. Like, your natural instinct is to be afraid, don't be afraid. Embrace her, right? Listen to her, love her. And that's the kind of thing that I think really characterized their relationship. So here's how I see how we could emulate that in a practical way. Women sometimes complain, or I try to help wives. They tell me, I try to tell him something, but he just wants to solve my problem. He doesn't really want to listen. Okay, well, it's like if you complain about a problem, he's going to think, oh, she needs a solution to a problem. And men are very good at solving problems. Like I ask my husband all the time, can you help me with this and solve this problem? And he's great. But sometimes what you really want is just to be to listen, to be understood, right? You want intimacy. You want someone to come into your world, into me, see, and, and be heard and loved, right? Well, that can only happen if I choose to be vulnerable by saying, here's my feelings, right? Here's what's going on in my heart, right? So John Paul says that tenderness, the essence of it has to do with feeling what the other person feels. It's very emotion focused. So when I share what I'm feeling, okay, then that's also can be very attractive and can also attract a man's loving response, right? Like if I feel, a friend of mine upset me and I feel hurt, okay, whatever, he feels like I want to care for her and protect her, right? So my feminine vulnerability arouses and attracts a masculine response. And in a similar way, men are vulnerable too, and can be and want that of their wives, right? In Proverbs 31, it says, the heart of her husband trusts in her. And that's beautiful. Okay, what does that mean? It means when he comes and he shares with me his dreams, okay, oh, I want to be a writer. And immediately you feel fear, like, oh my gosh, he's going to give up his job and try to do writing full time, right? You don't have to be afraid. You can just listen, right? And acknowledge his dreams, you create what's called sometimes in counseling, they call emotional safety. It means like, oh, let's say he loses his job, and you say, all right, honey, it's okay. I know you'll figure this out, and I trust you. Right. And not like, oh my gosh, you must have done this and blah, 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 and how, right. Intimacy that we all yearn for, and it's proper in a unique way to marriage. It's like one of the most intimate relationships out of all human relationships. That kind of intimacy comes from what I think John Paul calls tenderness. It's the willingness to create that emotional safety rather than, accusing or blaming or, whatever. And that's what I think we really want, in marriage, both man and woman. We want to be a part of each other's worlds.
It's very true. And so then how would we connect this to a religious life vocation where celibacy becomes a value take, and yet by choosing celibacy, you're not renouncing intimacy, right?
Right. So this is great. So in the Sermon on the Mount, it's like one surprise after another. The Pharisees are arguing about in what cases, might we have had divorce, and they're trying to trap the Lord because they're saying, look, Moses allowed it in XYZ case, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, it's a violation of a covenant, right? So what does the Lord say? John Paul comments on this in the Theology of the Body, and he says he's not going to take, Jesus is not going to take their question just within the confines of how they're wanted to be answered. He goes back to the beginning, okay? And he says, no, he who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, right? It's against a commandment. And they're shocked by this. They're like, what? You mean one man and one woman for life, right? And this is the grace he wants to give to married couples. This is the sacrament of marriage. But then he shocks them even more, okay? So you thought that was shocking, okay? One man and woman for life, right? The real shocker is that sometimes he calls men and women to be eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, right. Okay, which means the renunciation of the great good that marriage is for the sake of this deeper intimacy with God, right? And this is how John Paul II talks a lot about religious life. He uses, and we use, being man and a woman, we use this kind of spousal language, right? So a priest, for example, he's doing a similar, in an analogous way, thing that a husband and father does, right? He's renouncing himself. He's laying down his life for the sake of the bride. And that love, that consecration is fruitful. And that's why we call him Father, because he is a real father in the order of grace. He's fathering souls. It's a different way than marriage. We have a tendency in our culture to think if we don't have sex, we don't have intimacy, we don't have relationships. In fact, I think this is a side point, but one of the reasons why people have a hard time with the issue of same-sex marriage, it comes across like, shall I just be unhappy forever? Will I never have intimacy? Will I never have love? And that's simply not true. So, those who, renounce the great good of marriage for the sake of the kingdom are dedicating their lives wholly, WHOLLY, wholly to an intimacy with God that bears fruit in the world. And there's different ways of doing that. It could be either, in a cloister, you think like Saint Therese, who never left the cloister, who felt honestly that by my acts of love, by this consecration, souls are being converted in the world through what I do here. There's missionaries, there's diocesan priests, there's religious, right? And in the same way, their sexuality also matters, right? They're not saying, oh, some people are just asexual. No, we're properly sexual beings, right? And we always will be. And what that means is I deeply embrace, let's say for a woman, I'll tell you a quick story. One time I was discerning religious life early. That's another story. But and I asked these groups of religious sisters, well, what do you do? And they told me, well, you're asking the wrong question. It's not first what do we do, but who we are, right? And we are, by our consecration, living now the reality that is to come, right? We are living the intimacy with God. We are a witness, a powerful, because look, everything that the world says makes you happy. What? You have to have riches. You have to have, a sexual relationship. You have to be able to do whatever you want. This is what makes you happy. And their witness is a profound, I don't know if that's right? Because look what we have. We have this deep intimacy with God, which is in fact the deepest desire of every human heart, right? For everyone, for married couples, that's an important point, right? That, your spouse cannot completely fulfill every desire of your heart, right? Because you weren't made for it, you were made for God, right? And so they're this deep reminder of how much the human person is made for union with God.
Yeah, when our culture hears, what? We neither marry nor are given in marriage in heaven? What kind of a heaven is that? There's no sexual relationships in heaven? That's not heaven. That's why Jesus says that what heaven is something that we can't conceive in any way whatsoever. We've never seen anything like it. We can't even comprehend what heaven is. It's not that it's less than a world where you have physical intimacy with others. It's more. We can't imagine that, but it's something greater. And so I love how you pointed out that when people respond to a calling to the religious life, they're choosing actually something greater. And of course, the natural calling of man is to not be alone, like we're told in Genesis, to be in marriage. And so it's a supernatural calling to a life of celibacy for God. But of course, with the supernatural calling also comes, just like marriage does, comes with special graces that are gonna help you to properly follow the will of God. You've been so helpful, and this is clearly something that we could continue to unpack. There's more in the Gospels to discover that can teach us about the beauty of the sacrament of marriage. But we'll stop there because you have a family to tend to and a life of thinking and writing about the truth of the Catholic morality and the beauty of marriage. And so let's end with just a quick little list of recommendations from you on what we can be reading or what kind of resources we can turn to if we want to know more.
Yeah. There's a nice book by Dr. Edward Sri called Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love. So that, I think, is a nice basic introduction if you want to learn more about love and responsibility. It is a very, I mean, I read this stuff and I think it's a hard book to read, but very insightful. There's another book by, I believe his name is Robert Spinello, which is, I would say, the next level up. It's a commentary on this book. I have also benefited greatly from some of Brant Petra's writings on scripture. I think he does a fantastic job of unpacking what I would say sort of the hidden treasures of the Gospels by showing you what they really mean in reference to the Old Testament. In fact, the Gospels are, I'll tell you one quick story, is that I was reading this book by a rabbi. He was a Jewish, and he was told his whole life, "Oh, don't read the Gospels, because we're Jewish and we don't do that." And then when he opened them and started reading them, and as a young adult for the first time, he's like, "Oh my gosh, these are Jewish books. They're like written for Jewish people. Like these are Abraham's. Yeah. He's the son of Abraham. He's the son of David. He's the, And so what I loved about Petra's approach is that he unpacks a lot of those mysteries about the Eucharist, about Mary, about who the person of Christ is and his mission in the Gospels. So I would recommend probably those books.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly ask you about another book. This is a book that Father James Schall often recommended. And knowing that Edith Stein was, I think, somebody that John Paul II deeply cared for in her thought and her work and her life as a saint. The Essays on Woman, I think they're called. It's on my shelf at home. I've never read it, but would you recommend that maybe for men to read?
Yeah, I would recommend that. That's a great book. Okay. That's a great book to read. She has a lot of, actually, she was very influential for John Paul II, and a lot of his things writing on the feminine genius are direct correlations to her work. He liked her because she's both a phenomenologist and a Thomist and a Christian and a saint. Yeah. So you can't go wrong with that. A practical book I have also found helpful. There's a book by John Gray, Dr. John Gray, Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus. And he's not saying like you're actually from different planets, but what he's saying is that there's sort of an inner subjectivity, this is my words, but sort of an inner subjectivity about understanding how a man is and how a woman is, which I kind of see there's some correlations with John Paul II's thoughts. I'm actually kind of trying to write a book on trying to bring out some of these practical implications of what we mean by sexual complementarity, but maybe next year I'll have a book to recommend there. But those have been helpful, I think.
Good. Well, let me know when that book is ready to publish or published, and we'll definitely have a conversation about it. This has been a real pleasure, Dr. Alexander, to have this conversation with you, and I know people are going to greatly benefit from it. So thank you for joining me.
You're very welcome.